Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Way We Work speaker series. I am your host, Brendan Schrader, the CEO of Antenna and a proud alum of the Carlson School of Management. I'm incredibly excited for our program today. I wish I was here welcoming you to the University of Minnesota campus, but unfortunately, we can't do that. All that being said, I'm thrilled that we can open up this program to the public, but also to the 57,000 Carlson School alumni that are spread across the globe. Next slide, please. For those of you that this is your first Way We Work program, this program is really designed to bring our business community together alongside thought leaders, experts, and authors to discuss future of work topics. In addition to this live programming and speaker series, we also have a podcast called The Way We Work as well. To learn more about our podcast and future programming, you can visit us online at waywework.com. Next slide. The Way We Work is a collaboration between Antenna and the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. At Antenna, we connect companies with marketing experts to help them both adapt and grow their businesses. And because of our unique business model, we get to see the future of work unfold firsthand. And no doubt, many of you are very familiar with the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, their cutting edge research, their degree programs, and their executive programs. I encourage you to visit them online as well to get an updated look at their programming and offerings. Next slide. Before we get started today with our main presentation, I wanted to take a moment and introduce a fellow Carlson School alum, David Edgerton. Over the summer, the Carlson School has launched a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Action Group, and David is a key member of that group, and we'll take a few moments to talk about this work and the community. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us today in this session. We would like to just basically give you an idea of what's been going on so far. So if you could advance the next slide, that'd be great. Before we get into it, we want to share with you the commitment that we have as alumni, as faculty, as staff, and as a student body to diversity, equity, and inclusion. As you see here on the slide, it says that we are committed to fostering a diverse, inclusive community that encourages all to reach their full potential through learning, working, and service. By enhancing and sustaining an ethical, culturally grounded, and anti-racist institution, we will equip the leaders of tomorrow to live the values of business as a force for good. So the main reason we're engaging in these activities is to make sure that not only we make the Carlson School a better place, but through all of the things that we do with our students, our faculty and staff, and alumni, we make the planet a better place for everyone, regardless of their background, their history, their creed, or where they come from. We simply want to be able to make sure that if you're engaged with business activities, you're doing so in a way that encourages and promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next slide, please. As a part of our efforts, we have 5 focus areas that I'll briefly speak to. The first one is the student experience, faculty and staff cultural competency, admissions and student recruitment, hiring, and community partnerships. When we think about student experience, what we want to make sure happens is that when students come to the Carlson School, that they feel like they are supposed to be there, that they belong, and that they're included, not only as a part of their academic endeavors, but also as a part of their overall experience. And that doesn't matter if you're in the full-time program, part-time program, executive program. We want you to make sure that you have an excellent student experience, no matter who you are when you come to the Carlson School. The faculty and staff competency area, as far as cultural competency, what we want to do there is make sure that we put things in place to make sure that our folks that are working there, the teachers, the folks that are being advisors, anyone who has a touch point with the students is well aware of cultural intelligence and cultural competency. So we want to build into this some development for those wonderful individuals who will be a big part of the experience that our students experience. From an admissions standpoint, we're looking at what are we doing to attract the best talent, regardless of what they are and who they are and where they come from. So we want to make sure we put things in place that ensure that we have diversity throughout our classroom as far as the students go. And then with hiring, we're looking at how do we attract staff and faculty from diverse backgrounds? What are we doing there to ensure that we are a place where people feel they could come and thrive and contribute to their fullest potential, regardless of where they are? We don't want to take coming to Minnesota because it's cold as an excuse anymore. We have some of the best minds, the best companies, the best institutions, the best nonprofits in the United States, right here in the Twin Cities. And that should be enough to attract people. But we also need to make sure that we have the right inclusive workplace for them to come to. And then last but not least, community partnerships. That's all about making sure that the Carlson School is seen as a resource within multiple communities that we serve as the go-to place to not only help you be successful in business, but also to help you create a legacy for your own community. Next slide. So as you see, we have 4 focus areas: the students, alumni, employers, organizations, and the community, and then the faculty and staff. Each one of these circles represents a group of constituents, use cases, if you will, for where we want to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion has an impact. Next slide. With the current initiatives that we have going on, there are over 40 scholarship opportunities, 20 annual programs and events, 6 dedicated pipeline and recruitment initiatives, 4 alumni affinity networks, and 1 advisory board that's helping to make sure that the Carlson School is the go-to place, the inclusive workplace for all, with a diverse student population, faculty, and staff that also is equitable. Next slide. And that's it. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maggie Thomas, and I'm so happy to have all of you here, to see that there's so many of you here. My role at the Carlson School, along with working with the Way We Work team, is I manage the Graduate Business Career Center, where we are focused on helping our students land their dream jobs. And our office, along with the Undergraduate Business Career Center, provides thousands of coaching appointments for our students and our alumni per year, helping them figure out what they want to do with this degree and help them be really great interviewers. We plan hundreds of interviews on campus a year and hundreds of employer-related events. So you could say that we consider ourselves experts in this area at the Carlson School. But if there's anything that 2020 has taught us, it's that we all need to re-examine our areas of expertise and look at how we can be more inclusive and look at areas of where we might have bias. And I'm convinced that we can all be better at recruiting, at onboarding, at supporting our employees. And I know that personally, I learned how to look at my own bias pretty clearly when I had the pleasure of seeing Chaka speak in February in person before everything was via Zoom. And I was blown away. He helped me understand how I can better prepare our students and employers to be more inclusive interviewers. And he gives practical tips. So when the planning team talked about who do we want to really close out this 2020 Way We Work series and help us look forward to 2021, Chaka instantly came to mind. We want to ensure that we're providing resources for our community, for our students, for our alumni and friends of Antenna and friends of Carlson, that help people think about how they can recruit better and how they can be better employees and managers. And Chaka is just the person to do that. So I'm so thrilled to have him here. A little bit about him is he is the managing director of the Broad Center, a national organization focused on leading development. In his role, Chaka has crisscrossed the country identifying and developing talent and has interviewed nearly 3,000 professionals from every industry. He is the author of 2 books, Mastering the Hire, 12 Strategies to Improve Your Odds of Finding the Best Hire, and The Empowered Candidate, the power you have to land the job you deserve. Chaka holds a degree in economics and psychology from UCLA and an MBA from Stanford. And he's going to lead us in a really engaging presentation. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A and we will have a couple of breaks where Chaka will answer them. And you'll also be using the chat feature when Chaka directs you. So I'm now going to pass it off to him. You're in for a real treat, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Maggie, Brendan, and David. I appreciate the introduction. Let me pull up my screen here so that I can share my PowerPoint with you all. And I'm assuming you all can see that. And if for some reason it's not showing, someone let me know. It looks like it's showing. So first of all, hello to everyone. I hope you all are as well as you possibly can be in a year like this. The holidays are here, so hopefully there is some joy in your homes. I'm assuming many of you are working from home. I am working from home. I have kids, so that means I have kids here at home. I have locked myself in my room, and let's just hope that works. As I'm sure many of you know, it's pretty hard to keep a kid out of your room if they really want to get in, but they are under strict orders to leave me alone. So I have an hour of freedom here to spend with you all. I want to say a couple quick words about my professional background, just to add a little bit of context to what Maggie shared. So the organization I work for, the Broad Center, it's a national organization. It was founded by Eli Broad. You may know his name. He's in his late 80s at this point, but he's the founder of KB Home and Sun America, 2 Fortune 500 companies. He's an entrepreneur, a billionaire philanthropist, et cetera. Because of who he is, our organization sits at the intersection of many industries, private sector, public sector, nonprofit, et cetera. And because of the work we do, which is entirely focused on leadership development, every day I am on the phone with some leader in some country, in some part of the country, thinking about issues that they're facing and trying to help them work through those issues. And quite often they're thinking about talent. And issues around talent, and quite often as part of talent, or sometimes even outside of talent, they're thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion. So that is going to be the topic for today: diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm going to do my best, by the way, to keep an eye on time over here, because as I told the team, one of the things I was worried about was trying to do this topic justice in this short amount of time. So you may see me keeping an eye on time here every now and then. Diversity, equity, inclusion. When I have these conversations with people across the country, there is a common understanding at this point that diversity, equity, and inclusion matters. It is incredibly important. I know that there are still people who don't necessarily think that is a priority, think that's important. I have to operate under the assumption for this call that you are on this call because you think it matters. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time making the argument for why DEI matters. The quote you see in the bottom right of the corner there comes from a professor over at Stanford. And in many ways, it captures what I hear from everyone I talk with around the country. In short, different perspectives in the room lead to better decisions. And that is a common understanding. So I'm going to make that assumption. The assumption I can't make, though, here is that I know anything about your context. I do not know your context. I do not know what your organization looks like. I do not know where you are in your journey in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're beginning, middle, if you're further along, I don't know what your employees look like, et cetera. The topic of diversity is complex because our identities are complex. For myself as a Black man, issues of race, and in the work that, a lot of the work that we do, issues of race are top of mind. And what's going on in our country right now, race is top of mind. Gender is equally as important. Sexual orientation, sexual identity is just as important. The picture you have there in the upper right, in the upper left corner of the screen, represents many other parts of identity. I tried to find an image that captured many other things like age, and ageism is real. Religion, people with disabilities, those are other parts of identity, and you could keep going down that list. I don't know what that looks like in your organization. So for this conversation I'm having with you, what I decided was to focus on things that you could apply immediately, tomorrow, regardless of your context, Part of the work that I've been doing over the last 15 years with the Broad Center really is about getting people to take on practices. So that is the feel that you will have here today. All of our work is data-driven. There's research behind it. I will touch on those things briefly to give you a sense, but I will really try to focus as much as possible and give you some practice that you can actually use if you had to interview tomorrow. If you actually went back, or hopefully not tomorrow, tomorrow's Saturday, but if you had to interview on Monday, or if you're working on Saturday, if you had to do it on Saturday. So that's the feeling you're gonna have here. I'm gonna move relatively quickly. There will be pauses for Q&A. There will be some moments where I ask you to use the chat box to have a little bit of interaction. And by all means, if you have a question related to race or gender or anything specific, do not shy away from it. I don't shy away from it in my conversations because of the limitations of a webinar and I can't see you and I don't know the context. I'm going to give you these practices that are immediately applicable and will make a difference. But I leave it to you to be able to figure out how to apply those in your particular context. Here's our agenda. We're going to roughly try to split it in half. We'll see how that works out. But we'll talk about how to assess talent or interviewing. As Maggie mentioned, that's where we met, where I was doing a workshop on interviewing. We'll talk about bias, culture fit, and inclusion bias, culture fit, and intuition around interviewing. And then in the second half or so, or maybe it'll end up being the second third or so, we will talk about communicating for inclusion, generational gaps, kind of new people, quote unquote, the new generation, and onboarding, and some practices there to promote inclusion. So let's get started. I want to share with you a couple sobering facts about interviewing. These facts come from a study that was done by two psychologists, Frank Schmidt and John Hunter. It was a meta-analysis of 85 years of interviewing. And here's what they discovered. Unstructured interviews are correct 25% of the time. 25% of the time. Unstructured meaning you go into the interview, you're kind of asking questions off the top of your head. You don't necessarily have rubrics and criteria, et cetera. You just kind of, you think you know what you need and you go into the interview and ask questions. Structured interviews are correct 50% of the time. That's the number that always surprises people, that number is so low, that on average, even a structured interview is only correct 50% of the time. This is when we actually do have rubrics and criteria, et cetera. Your job is not to be right 100% of the time. This is kind of an underlying philosophy that you'll hear kind of as I talk today. There's no way you're going to be right 100% of the time. You're going to have some misses when you're interviewing. But your job is to do everything you possibly can do to keep increasing the odds of making the right decision. And you can do that. You can put practices in place, ones that I share with you, that dramatically increase those odds. Removing bias leads to more accurate decisions. Is the really key thing to remember here. You're trying to make accurate decisions, and what we're going to talk a lot about here is removing bias that allows you to make those really accurate decisions. And when you make more accurate decisions, you end up identifying talent that other people have very likely overlooked. And that's where diversity, equity, and inclusion ties into this. There are many people who fit into this category that we think of as diversity that are overlooked because of bias throughout the interview process and in other places. Removing that bias leads to those accurate decisions. So that is what we're shooting for across the next 45 minutes or so that we have together. All right, so where do we begin? Let's start with pre-interview. And this will feel a little bit like 101 for some of you, depending on where you are kind of in your organization in terms of hiring. But you have to always separate skills from traits. So let's talk first pre-interview. Before you even interview, you want to separate skills from traits. A moment ago, I showed the data where just going from unstructured to structured went from 25% to 50%. That structure removes bias. One of the main things you can do to remove bias in any interview process is to put as much structure in place as possible. That squeezes out some of the bias. This kind of falls into that space where you're adding even more structure by really thinking carefully about skills and traits. So I want to use this first chance here to see if we can use the chat box in here. I want you guys, and anyone can type this into the chat box. Just type in an example of what you think a skill is for your job, a skill for your job. And I'm the only person who can see the chat box. Let's see, yes, somewhere over here. So just type in your chat into the chat box what you view as a skill. And I'm going to try to find this here. So chat to me what a skill is. Okay, there we go. All right, good. Good, they're flowing in. And by the way, no one can see these except me, so remove any of the worries that you have about someone judging your answer. Yes, these are flowing in. So Excel, negotiation, accounting, writing, data analysis, estimating, relationship management, empathy has come in. Good. There's still technology understanding, event planning, listening, customer service, time management, communication. Okay, good. So now let's switch over. Type in for me, what would you describe as a trait required for your job? A trait, and I'm gonna jot a note down here. A trait. So what do you call traits? Okay, good. Curiosity, outspoken, empathy, personable, hardworking, good, agreeable, friendly, flexibility, collaboration, integrity, awesome, motivated. Okay, collaboration, outgoing, open-minded, resilient. Awesome. Pause there. Okay, good. They're flowing in. This is great to see. Great to see. Thank you. Okay, so I want to call out one that I actually saw on both lists, and this always happens. And this is not to say that the person who put this in there is wrong. So don't take it in that way at all, because this all depends on your context. But one that showed up on both that I saw there as they were flowing in was the word empathy. Is empathy a skill? Is it a trait? I would probably put that in the trait box. The reason I think of it this way is because of how we often, go back to the screen here, how we think of skills versus traits. Skills are what you do, traits are how you do it. And this is an important distinction, what you do and how you do it. If I use that definition, then empathy would fall under traits. Right? Is it something that, is it what you do or is it how you do what you do? Do you lead with empathy? This is an important distinction, and it's really important to do this work on the front end of separating out those two things, because traits are where bias lives. If bias squeezes into your interview process at any place, it's going to happen in the trait side. It's very rare that you see bias happen as much on the skill side. It's almost always where people start questioning like fit and can this person work here and how do they operate. That's how identity affects the interview process. It affects how you do what you do or how people perceive how you do what you do. So I always encourage people to do that exercise. Write down those responsibilities that are needed for the job, separate them out to skills and traits, and then have a conversation about, are we accurately separating out these two things? Because if you're not careful, traits will be where the bias slips in, because you haven't made a really clean definition and it gets fuzzy and people aren't clear on what is it that we're really looking for. And you start having conversations about fit, and we're going to come back to that in a moment. The first thing I want to talk about before I go to kind of culture fit and fit is, once you've identified your traits, who do you think should assess for traits and when? You don't have to type this one in. Just take a moment and think to yourself, if we separate out skills and traits, who assesses for traits and when? Is there a certain person in your organization, a manager, colleagues, peers, etc.? It's a little bit of a trick question, and you may have the answer to it, but everyone should be assessing for traits every single time they see the candidate. Everyone, every time. The reason you want to do this is because traits are notoriously difficult to identify and they're very subjective. So if you think about all those, if I think about all those things that were listed a moment ago, my definition of resilience might be very different than your definition of resilience. And this is again where identity comes into, and background, and people having different life experiences. My definition of humility might be different than your definition of humility. Your definition of confidence may be my definition of arrogance. So what you want is you want everyone assessing it every time. So the natural question then is, well, how in the road are you going to do that? How can everyone assess the candidate on these traits every time? Well, what you need is a tool. And what you see on your screen now is a template of a tool that you should have in your interview packet. And we're going to share out these notes with you all, by the way, at the very end, so you'll have access to what this looks like. But assuming on your interview day, you have an interview packet, you have a set of questions, you have notes, etc. The very last page should have a screen that shows a page that shows this. It basically lists the traits. You've taken the time to identify those. Then you have a column that says notice this, a column that says notice the opposite. Every single interviewer has this every single time they interview the candidate. And all you're doing at the very end of the interview is you're just putting a check mark, whether or not you notice something or notice the opposite. There's no scoring. Again, it's really hard to say, is this person a 1 or a 5 on can-do attitude? It is complex. You may have specific questions that address traits, but traits are often something that people feel, right? They are things that people identify across the interview. They show up in one place, may not show up in another place. This is why you have to do it every single time. This is also why at the very bottom there, you'll notice it says leave blank if unobserved. Unobserved is not considered negative. The hard thing about traits is it's hard to control when they show up. You may interview a person and they don't show any of those particular traits in that interview because the questions that you ask didn't necessarily feed to that. They didn't show up in that way, or they are more reserved, or they are more introverted and they don't carry themselves in a way where the traits show up. So you have to realize this may not show up, and that's not a negative. There are times when you'll have an interview and you'll come out of the interview and you won't have checked any of these because it just didn't show up. That tells you we need to be more aggressive about identifying these traits, and we need to make sure we keep looking out for it in the other interviews. That's why every interviewer across every interview is really important here. The reason you have noticed the opposite there is because quite often the opposite of a trait is easier to pick up than the actual trait itself. It is easier to pick up on pessimism, for example, than optimism, and you want to capture that. And that is also really important to capture, because if they have the opposite of a trait and you see that consistently, that is a cause for concern. What you're doing here with a mechanism like this is you are gathering evidence across time and across interviewers. And then you're making a decision, a much more accurate decision based on evidence, a pattern, a trend across time and across interviewers, rather than a decision based on bias and personal preference when you haven't taken the time to accurately identify your traits and then create a process that allows you to collect information on it. That's why at the end of these conversations, people often will say, I just didn't quite connect with the person. They didn't quite fit. I wasn't quite sure if they could do the job. And it's very fuzzy. And fuzziness is where bias lives. Bias loves to live in those shadows. And people can't quite articulate it. And really, it's about something else going on inside them versus what's actually truly, truly relevant for the job. So include this form, back page of every interview packet, and you're going a long way towards being much more concrete about the decisions you're making and the accuracy of those decisions. Okay, so that's something that you actually do during the interview. Let's talk a little bit about post-interview, and let me keep track of time here. Post-interview, you do want to think about this idea of culture fit. It's a common question. People ask it. There are some people who would suggest we should stop thinking or stop asking about culture fit because it is so fuzzy. Culture fit can be a gatekeeper. It can prevent diversity in your organization because it is code for something else, or there's an unspoken when people say this person wasn't a culture fit. So there are people who say don't ask about culture fit. I am not in that camp. I am going to, and I'm going to make an assumption here, I'm going to assume that if you have a strong sense of your culture, you've identified your traits, you've had conversations about what are the formal and informal ways that our culture operates. If you know what your culture looks like, you have to ask the question, is this person a culture fit? Because we all know that culture matters. And we all know if a person doesn't fit, even if your definition of it is not a great one, if they don't fit, they're going to struggle in your organization. So I think it's actually a disservice if you don't ask that question, is this person a culture fit? Again, the assumption here is you've done some thinking on what your culture fit is. You've identified traits. Traits are often a big piece of culture and fit. But if you're going to ask this question, you absolutely have to ask two more questions, because if you ask this question alone, you're in trouble. You're opening the door for bias. So if you're going to ask, is this person a culture fit? And let's say the answer is like, we're not sure. This person might not be a culture fit. You have to ask another question. And that question is, can this person adjust to our culture? That question is really important because is this person a culture fit assumes that the person can't change, that the person is static, right? Is this person a culture fit? Nope. All right, they're not going to work out here. That you're pretending as though the person can adjust. When every single person on this call, we have all had to adjust to some organization, to some team in the past. How do we know this person can't do the same thing? So if you're going to ask, is this person a culture fit? Then ask, can this person adjust to our culture? Really critical. That you can't stop there though. You have to ask one more question, because the problem with asking this question alone, or just these two questions alone, is you assume that this candidate should adjust. That your culture is so incredible that this person needs to change things about themselves to fit in. And that is problematic. That again is where you can lose diversity, because if things that are core to my identity, I have to change them to fit in, that is not healthy. That's not healthy for me. That's not healthy for your organization, right? So you do want to know, can they adjust? Are they flexible? But it's a really tricky area where if you're asking somebody to change something about themselves, that is truly who they are, you can do a disservice to them and your organization. So what you have to ask on top of that is, can this person be a culture add? That is a really important question, because maybe what this thing that this person brings to the table, the thing that you're not quite sure if it fits, maybe it strengthens your organization and your culture. Maybe it's a benefit. So reframe it. Instead of it being a deficit, is it an asset? This thing that's different about this person. Having this type of concrete conversation about culture, right? As important as culture is, you want to ask a series of questions. This allows you to understand your culture and be much more transparent and honest about, like, what is it that we're talking about here? And what is it that this candidate represents, right? And can they adjust, and can they add value with that thing that's somehow different from them? Opens the door again to talent in a way that you previously wouldn't have. And it also opens the door to you understanding much more about your organization, its culture, and how you are using it as a gatekeeper, whether or not that is a relevant way to keep people out. You remove some of that subjectivity, you have a much more concrete conversation, and that's really what this is about. Okay, so I've talked about subjectivity quite a bit here, as though it's a bad thing. Subjectivity really is kind of around intuition, your personal preferences, your gut instinct. And subjectivity actually isn't a bad thing. So I'm going to go again a little bit against the grain here and suggest that maybe subjectivity, there's value in it. So in what way could there be value? There's been tons of research done on intuition, on gut instinct. There's a book called Blink that was written on the topic. And the whole book was about the power of thinking without thinking. And it suggests that absolutely intuition is real and you should rely on it. There's been magazines that cover the topic. There's been tons of research domain doesn't guarantee good intuition in another domain. So basically, if you're good at your job, that doesn't mean you're good at interviewing for your job. Those are two very different things. Next, research shows that we're better at detecting, for example, deception and sexual orientation when we rely on intuition instead of reflection. Two things to mention here. So one is the idea that you can use intuition to identify certain things. The question is, are those things relevant? Deception may be relevant in an interview, but the person's sexual orientation is not relevant, right? This idea of intuition versus reflection is one that we're going to come back to. Reflection is really important. So we're going to come back to that idea in a minute. But this second point here leads to the third, which is basically that intuition is dangerous because it is subject to cognitive and social biases, such as racial prejudice or prejudice because of sexual orientation. So just because the things that you pick up on feed into your intuition, because you can intuit them, doesn't mean they're relevant and doesn't mean that they're not dangerous. You have to be very thoughtful there. Another point here that's worth mentioning is that intuition in some domains is actually much more accurate than in other domains. Weather forecasters, test pilots, chess masters, their intuition is much more reliable than psychologists, admissions officers, judges. And I would put interviewers in that second category. Right? And the problem here is, as an interviewer, if your intuition says, I'm not going to hire this person, you have no way of knowing if your intuition was correct. Right? The outcome of that intuition is much fuzzier versus if you're a weather forecaster and you say, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, and it does or it doesn't, you immediately got a feedback loop coming back to your intuition, and your intuition actually gets honed. So that's the problem with intuition in interviewing, because you don't really have a really solid feedback loop. Which brings us to our final point, and this is the practice that we're building to. The role of deliberation in honing instincts and knowing when to trust them reveals reflection's close collaboration with intuition in both its development and deployment. So the process of reflecting is what hones your intuition. So that's what we're going to use for the next practice. That's going to be kind of the core of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about mindfulness, intuition, and bias. When I say the word mindfulness, people often start thinking about yoga. And, imagine us sitting in a room, chanting together or doing some pose, which is wonderful. Nothing against that. But that's not what we're going to do here when we talk about mindfulness. When we talk about mindfulness, we're talking about a mental state that involves an increased awareness of our emotions, thoughts, and surroundings, accompanied by a sense of non-judgment. That is the fancy way of saying something that's much, actually a pretty simple thing. Mindfulness is thinking about what you're thinking about. I prefer the non-fancy way of thinking about these things. Mindfulness is thinking about what you were thinking about, it is reflecting. There's been a lot of research on mindfulness in terms of its effects on intuition and on bias. A lot of that is in the field of healthcare, where decisions that are being made, whether they are accurate or inaccurate, truly have life or death circumstances. So nurse practitioners and doctors get trained on mindfulness. And it is a place that a lot of the ideas about how to use mindfulness to make the right decision is borrowed and used in the interview context. So if you do the research on this, you will find a lot of it coming out of healthcare. So mindfulness, thinking about what you're thinking about, reflecting, honing your intuition. One of the most important things you can do pre-interview in terms of a practice is actually knowing what your biases are. Knowing what your biases are. I'm going to keep a track of time here. I'm going to go for maybe 5 more minutes and then pause for a couple of questions and dive into the second half. So know your biases. Know your biases. So the best way you can do that is make a bias list. Make a list of what your biases are. And that may sound scary or like, what in the world does that mean? But you want to become of your personal biases and you want to jot them down. even if you wouldn't say them out loud, whatever they are. This list is for you. This is a personal practice. And the best way to do this is not necessarily during the interview process. You can do that. That's a place to capture it afterwards. But the better way to do this is just, what do you immediately notice about people when you first meet them? Just in everyday life, just start thinking about what you're thinking about. When you first meet someone, when you first see someone, what are the things that you notice? I can tell you for myself, I notice people's shoes, for example. I notice whether or not they make eye contact. I notice whether or not they give a firm handshake, right? Those are some of my biases. So my bias list has those things on it. Those are things that I notice. Here's the problem. Those innocent biases, right, that aren't necessarily related to, don't seem like they're related to race or gender or sexual orientation or anything else, handshakes, shoes, eye contact, they often overlap with societal biases. So my bias for firm handshakes, well, that means I'm biased towards men. Most men give firm handshakes. And quite often women don't give firm handshakes. When women do give a firm handshake, I notice it. It stands out. That's how I started to realize, there's a bias I have here. And suddenly I'm like, oh, firm handshake. And my mind starts spinning on, what does that mean, a firm handshake or not? Or if a man didn't give me a firm handshake, my mind starts spinning on, what does that mean? And suddenly this thing that I don't really think relates to anything suddenly has an impact in the interview process. Shoes, another thing. Right? Noticing shoes, that could be related to socioeconomic status. I remember when I interviewed for business school, I wouldn't even want to show you what I wore to my interview for business school. I came from nonprofit before I went to business school. I had no idea of what the norms were there. And I know that they were judging me based on those norms. And the same thing can happen based on something that to you just seems relatively innocent, not a big deal. Eye contact, again, another thing. Here in Western culture, eye contact is a big deal. There are other cultures where making eye contact is actually a sign of disrespect. Right? To look at someone in the eye is disrespectful. So you have to be thoughtful about what your personal biases are, but first you have to capture them. You have to jot them down because they can affect the accuracy of your decision making when you're in the interview. Is it relevant or not? Your personal biases may have nothing to do with what you are hiring for. But if you don't know what they are, you won't control them, and instead they will control you. They will start feeding into your intuition, and you will think like, I've made a decision based on my strong gut, but it's really completely irrelevant. So that's the very first thing you can do to try to control bias and intuition. At the very bottom there, I squeezed in one last thing. I'll just say it quickly. I talked about it in the book, but sharing your bias list with a co-interviewer is a really powerful practice. Doing this really depends on the trust and the culture in your organization. But it's a practice we have in our organization where I share my bias list with my co-interviewer, who I at this point trust, and they share theirs with me. And we know, it helps us keep each other accountable. It's something we can call each other out on, etc. So for me, that is again one of those things that I don't know your context to know whether or not you can do it. All right, one more practice here, and then I want to see if there's a couple questions we can answer. Are we doing on time? Okay, I'm doing okay. I'm a little bit behind. This is a practice that you can do during your interview, at the start of the interview. It's called parking your first impression. First impressions are real. And first impressions are quite often driven by your gut instinct, your immediate reaction, and they also can be filled with bias. Those same biases we discussed a moment ago. But that doesn't mean that you should try to stop your first impression. That's not natural. You cannot control whether or not you have a first impression. So again, I don't try to go against the way our minds operate. Try to figure out, this is how the brain operates. How can we control it? How do we manage it? The process here is called parking first impression. And what you see on the screen here is something you can do as a personal practice. You could also do it if you have all your interviewers have kind of like a template like this on the very first page of the interview packet. I recommend doing it as a personal practice first. Try it out for yourself, see how it works. Literally what it means is if you have your interview packet, your packet of papers, at the very bottom, just draw a line, and on one end write yes, other end write no, and the middle write I don't know. As soon as the candidate walks into the room, right, you shake hands, you say a couple words. Right? As you're sitting down, just check mark your first impression about how well this candidate will do in the interview. I guarantee you already have an impression the moment they walk in the door. There's research that shows, and this is done across interviewers, across contexts, that shows 25% of interviewers have already made their decision 5 minutes into the interview. 5 minutes and they've made a decision. 60% of candidates have made their decision 15 minutes into the interview. So you have to ask yourself, well, then, why are we spending an hour with a candidate if a fourth of us have already made the decision in the first 5 minutes? Well, it turns out what's happening for the rest of the interview is people are confirming what they already made up their mind on in those first 5 minutes or those first 15 minutes. Right? That is really hard to stop. But what you can do is notice it, capture it for yourself. And what you want to do is increasingly put yourself in the I don't know bucket. You want to remind yourself, I don't know. So you may find yourself in yes, no initially, but over time, you will remind yourself that I don't know. Even acknowledging that, yes, you think you know that this kind of interview will interview well, or you don't know, even that practice alone causes you to be mindful and allow you to catch yourself. The key here is the instruction at the bottom of that, which is basically once you've captured it, put it aside. Maybe it's a relevant data point, maybe it's not. Who knows? I can't tell you if your gut is strong or not. But you put it aside and then focus on the interview. That process of taking it out of your head, putting it aside, and then focusing on the interview allows you to have a process that is much less impacted by that first impression than if you just let that first impression happen in your mind, you're not aware of it, and then it's affecting everything, and you're just kind of confirming what you already made up at the very beginning. Okay, I want to pause here because we're going to go to communicating for inclusion. Brendan, I'm not sure if there's a question or not that is relevant for us to dig into. Happy to take a minute here.
Yes, there is. There's a question that I think is related to the traits and culture conversation that you talked about a few slides back. If you are looking to shift the culture of the organization and or increase diversity, do you need to take a hard look at the traits you're considering in candidates and the cultures and the values of the organization? Do you believe those are related? Does the organization need to do a hard look at traits and culture and values if they're looking to increase diversity, because maybe they've been continuing to hire the same type of people? What's your comments on that?
Yes, so the short answer is yes, absolutely. I found that many places don't. So number one, the traits exercise is probably a little bit easier than actually identifying what your culture is, because most people have some version of this in their job descriptions. But I would start there because quite often you'll find patterns in those traits that tell you a lot more about your culture, right? Like we like people who are fast learners. We like people who are technologically savvy, et cetera. Some of those things are very valid. That's not a negative. But you want to look at those traits and say, could any of those traits possibly overlap with a bias around race or gender or sexual orientation, et cetera? So you almost want to do an audit of those traits and say, are there any things there that in some way could interfere with diversity? And then you want to have a really hard conversation about those things. I'm going to come back to this, I'll say now, but like leadership, senior leadership, is really important in that kind of conversation because those aren't easy conversations. So you have to have someone who's a little bit more senior who can talk about that with you so that you can make a decision on, like, is this trait still relevant? How do we address this trait if we find that it actually is exclusive in some way? You want to have the same kind of conversation about culture though, because quite often culture happens informally, right? So the traits would tell you one thing, but there's these other informal ways of interacting that no one has ever captured anywhere. It doesn't show up in the job description. So that's another more complicated conversation you have, but you do have to say, what are the formal ways we have of interacting and what are the informal ways? And again, you have to take these things out of people's heads, put them on paper, look through that list and say, okay, are any of these things interfering with our ability to bring different types of talent into organization? So the short answer was yes. The longer answer is get it out of your head, put it on paper, and then you have to have someone who has kind of senior leadership, enough authority to be able to say, hey, this is problematic. We got to talk about this, because people struggle with saying, oh, well, we're no longer going to kind of consider this as part of our culture. You have to be willing to address those things.
Okay, I'm going to let you move on to the second half. We'll keep getting questions here as this goes on and have more Q&A at the end.
Great, thank you. All right, keeping an eye on time here. We've got 16 minutes, so I'm going to move. Well, I've already been moving fast, so I'm probably going to stay at that pace. Communication. So communicating for inclusion, I want to say a couple of words here. As I mentioned at the beginning, I don't know your context. So there are things here that are commonly talked about when we think about communicating that I'm not going to cover because I don't know your context and I won't do them justice. We have 15 minutes. There are things like microaggressions that are incredibly important that you should research if you're not familiar with them and get an understanding of. There is inclusive language that you should think about on your resumes and job descriptions that also are important. But they deserve much more than 15 minutes of your time. There is definitely pronouns and the use of pronouns, and whether you put it in your email address is a conversation that you should be thinking about and learning much more about. So communicating for inclusion, it is a really deep topic that deserves much more attention when we think about that level. Again, what I want to give you are very specific practices that you can use. So I want to start with a little bit of research here just to get us grounded. The Capor Center did a study that showed that women are twice as likely to quit as men from a job, and Black and Latino employees are 3.5 times as likely to quit. And this study found that inclusion leads to retention. A lot of times that happens because people do not feel included, they feel excluded. So that's one quick stat there. Another study done by Gallup found that 40% of people leave their job within 6 months. Within the first 6 months they leave. And the most common reason in the wording there is funny to me is post-hire shock, which all of us have probably experienced at some point. Like, whoa, this place is not what I thought it would be, or this job is not what I thought it would be. And when you are a candidate with a different background, you layer on top of that, like, whoa, maybe this is because of my background, or I'm not being, I don't feel included here. And that post-hire shock has a whole nother layer of complexity to it when you layer in diversity. The lack of role clarity and communication is quite often the underlying the issue there. And kind of a summarizing sentence there from that study was clarity of expectations is perhaps the most basic of employee needs and is vital to performance. So we're gonna knit those two things together. The idea that identity and diversity is incredibly important when you're bringing somebody into an organization in terms of retention. So there's 2 hurdles we're going to talk about here. One of them is a generational gap inclusion. And then in a moment, we'll talk about something called the curse of knowledge and tie some practices to it. So in terms of generational gap, the reality, as many of you know, is that millennials, the next generation, and even Gen Z are already in our workforce, and they approach work in a different way than baby boomers or Generation X, et cetera. I'm going to talk about millennials for a moment here, but I'm going to try to move away from it because that language is loaded. There's a lot of stereotypes in it. Millennials is actually a broad group. There are millennials who are in their late 30s or early 40s, et cetera, if you really look at what a millennial is. I want to share a couple of things though. There is a ton of research that shows, so number one, the perception about millennials is that they have these outsized expectations, among other things. Research, however, shows that the expectations that millennials have of the workforce is actually no different than the expectations of previous generations, right? The desire to be valued, desire to be seen and heard and respected, to be included. That's no different. What's different is the way they voice the expectations and the pace at which they expect those things to happen, right? So there is a difference in their expectations about those expectations, but the underlying expectations are actually pretty common. That's actually not that different. That is really important though, because generational gaps also overlap with other forms of identity: race, gender, exclusion, race, gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to move away from the word millennial for a moment here and use different framing to make a point as we move towards a practice. So you have fresh eyes and historian. Fresh eyes is kind of when you think of a millennial, the person who's coming in with a new perspective. Historian is what you think of as the person who's Generation X or baby boomer, right? You could use that category. The reality, though, is that anyone can be a fresh eyes. If you are new to an organization, you are coming in with a new perspective, and you have an expectation that you will be valued, that perspective will be heard. If you're a historian, you could be a millennial, as I pointed out earlier, and you could have been in your organization for 10 years, and you have more of what's called a historian perspective. Right, so I want to shift away from the millennial versus kind of Generation X or any other label and use fresh eyes versus historian because it's really important to think of it that way. So when someone comes in with fresh eyes, here's kind of what happens. That person says, I have a new idea, right? The historian says, or the historian hears, you've been doing this wrong, right? That's what we hear. I'm in the historian category. So when someone comes in with a fresh perspective, I have a new idea. My reaction is, you've been doing this wrong. That's how I feel. That's how I feel like what I'm hearing. It's kind of what happens in this dynamic. The historian then says back to the fresh eyes, right? We've tried that before. Hey, okay, look, young buck. Yep, I get it. Yeah, you're full of ideas. We've tried that before. You know, we're good. And what the fresh eyes hears is that the historian is saying, we're inflexible. We're not open to change. And this dynamic just happens all the time, right? Whether you want to call it millennial or fresh eyes, new person comes into an organization, new perspectives, kind of gets shut down, et cetera. And that leads to feelings of being excluded, feeling of like, I'm not included here. It leads to that thing. And by the way, historians also can feel like they are not included. They can feel like, okay, we've got a new generation of workers coming in. I'm the older generation and no one's really valuing what I have to say. And I've been through this so many times and now I'm the one feeling excluded. This feeling of inclusion and exclusion can happen on both sides. This is really important, though, when we think about kind of the newer generation of workers coming in, because one of the things that is true about millennials and Generation Z is that their expectations around diversity, equity, inclusion are much more progressive. Again, generalization here, but yeah, generalization, but largely holds true. Their expectations about how quickly they should be included. Their feelings about inclusion, they feel that they should be included in decisions much more quickly. So this generational gap overlaps with diversity, equity, inclusion. It overlaps with decisions that get made. And it overlaps, by the way, with how quickly they think others should be included as well. So this is really important to think about, this generational gap. So what I'm going to give here are 2 tips, keeping an eye on time here. I'm going to try to do this in 5 minutes. 2 tips for the fresh eyes. I'm going to start first for the people who are newer to an organization. And this is advice that was given to me by an African-American leader who was about 20 years older than me. And when I was coming in as a fresh eyes, and he said to me, you will be better at going against the grain if you first take time to know the grain. He was like, I'm not saying don't go against the grain. You're going to be better at what you're trying to change if you take time to know the grain. And the very specific practice there, if you are in the fresh eyes category, is to lead with curiosity. Curiosity allows you to think critically without sounding critical. Right? Historians, right? The thing that is most likely to turn us off is when we feel like we're being criticized by someone who's new. You just have to be aware of that. I'm not saying that's actually a good thing. We have to be much more open to ideas. But if you're fresh eyes and you want to move the needle, lead with curiosity. It has the same underlying function as critical thinking, but you don't sound critical. You're asking questions, you're being curious, and it allows you to take what you've learned and then come back to that same person with an idea as though it was generated from them. You can move the needle much more. So that's a mental tip for fresh eyes on kind of closing that generational gap. Now, I do have to think about the historians. And yes, history repeats itself. So when we say we've tried that before, absolutely true, but it doesn't repeat itself like this circle that just keeps going. And again, this same advice was given to me by the same gentleman he'd been a fresh eyes, he became a historian, and he saw me on that same path. What he said to me was, history repeats itself like this. It's more like a coil, right? Where time moves and history repeats itself, absolutely. But things are different each time. So if you're a historian and someone comes to you with an idea, you have to ask yourself, what's different this time? Resources, time, context, the world around us, what's different that might allow this new person's ideas and perspectives to be included in what we're doing, so that you don't automatically, because of a gap between fresh eyes and historians, create a feeling of exclusion, create a feeling of like, your idea doesn't belong here, you don't belong here, you don't understand you don't understand us. So train yourself to think of, yes, history repeats itself, but it's a coil. And that'll go a long way to minimizing some of those communication hurdles that tend to happen at the very outset of a relationship that lead to feelings of exclusion versus inclusion. All right, one more tip here. Let's see, how much time do we have? All right, I'm gonna keep going. We may have time for like 2 minutes of questions at the end, we'll see. Curse of knowledge and inclusion. So there is a cognitive bias that occurs when we unknowingly assume others have the background to understand what we're communicating. It's called the curse of knowledge. We unknowingly assume others have the same background to understand what we're communicating. Assumptions about others is always problematic, particularly when you assume their background is similar to yours. Even if they, look different than you, we make these assumptions. It's a cognitive bias. It happens in our mind. So if you layer this in with diversity, equity, inclusion, people are coming into your organization who have different backgrounds, different experiences. But we assume there's a common language, a common understanding, and therefore we don't give all the knowledge to them that they need to be effective. And then when they aren't as effective, we then wonder, what's going on with this person? They're not that strong. They're not a fast learner. They're not, able to kind of get in the groove of how this organization operates. When the reality is the curse of knowledge at the front end didn't allow you to actually share with them all the things that they need to know. And it's really hard to fix this yourself, because again, these things are in your mind, they're implicit. It's really hard to capture them. So 2 tips on how to move past that. One of them is you have to move beyond kind of the open door policy. Quite often people say, well, I have an open door, anyone can come see me. It's really hard for a new person to come see someone who's been in an organization. There's a power dynamic there, particularly if there's any kind of difference based on diversity. So moving beyond the open door policy is really important. So what that basically means is don't count on them just coming to you, send them on a listening tour. New employees go on a listening tour. For many of you, this may be something that you already do, but have them go talk to key other people in the organization, because those people also have different backgrounds than you, and they will fill in the gaps on what you didn't know that you need to tell this person. That's really the driver of a listening tour. A lot of people do listening tours because they think it's about building relationships. It's about filling gaps in their knowledge because you didn't cover everything, because you don't know all the things that you're assuming they know things that they don't know. What's really important in this process is having them circle back to you in between with questions and reactions, because that allows them to kind of move in and out of your open door. It creates a feeling of like, I can actually go to them, share what I'm thinking about, go back out, get information, and that sharing of information closes that gap and allows them to feel much more included. The bottom bullet there I added just kind of as a personal leadership advice is when you're grappling with something, you should go on a listening tour. Go out, talk to other people, understand how to think about it, people at different levels in the organization. By the way, this has the added benefit of reducing microaggressions. Again, there's research on this, but management by walking around actually reduces many of the other impacts that happen around DEI, microaggressions being one of those. But listening tours is a key one. The final tip I'll give here, and then we'll pause for questions if there are any, is to create a user manual. So, the way you overcome the curse of knowledge is you give the gift of knowledge, you do listening tours, create a user manual. So here's how you think about this practice. The way you think about it is if you were a gift in a box and you land on the desk of your new employee and they're like, oh, here's this nice box, and they opened it up and you, their boss, are inside, right? What would the instructions say about how you operate and how they should interact with you? Like, we don't come with user manuals, right? None of us do. Right? So the idea here is give your new employee a user manual. Here's the reason why, right? User manuals help people adapt to one another by offering an explicit description of one's personal values and how one works best with others. This shortens the learning curve for new employees, right? And helps everyone avoid misunderstandings. Because what's going to happen is the new employee, this new person, right? Particularly if we're talking the context of DEI, this person who already is different from you or from other people in the organization, they're going to figure you out, but it's going to take them a month or two. In that time, they're going to make mistakes, there's going to be misunderstandings, and that's going to lead to people leaving the organization because there was this lack of clarity that is really key and foundational for everyone. So creating a user manual shortens that learning curve, right? And it helps avoid all those misunderstandings that later on, you're not sure what happened, they're not feeling included, and it leads to people exiting and going someplace where they feel more included. So here are examples of what a user manual looks like. This is one example. If you search Abby Fallick user manual, you'll find this example, but this includes some things that you literally write this up and you share it with your new employee. By the way, we have our teams, each team member do this as well. They do it and they share with each other, we discuss it. It is really a really good team building. It allows people to understand each other much more beyond kind of the front that we all put up in front of us. It creates a feeling of inclusion, etc. Another version of this, I'll just put this on the screen really quickly here. There are many ways to write this. And again, I created on the right there, I gave you some advice on how to search and find this. And I know that feels a little bit over the top, but if you search user manual, you're going to come up with a user manual for a lawnmower or something, which is not helpful at all. So user manual, New York Times, and you'll find an article about how to use this tool. These things are really, really important because at the end of the day, employees want to feel heard. They want to feel connected. They want to feel valued, respected. They want their ideas put in place. And if you start off relationships in this way, you're going to build a much stronger relationship and a much stronger culture that allows you to tap into the broad range of diversity that exists out there. There's an incredible level of talent out there. Many organizations are missing out on it. And if you think about what you're doing in your hiring process and you think about what you're doing when you're onboarding people through the lenses that we've discussed and put those practices into place, the organization will benefit, and the people you bring into your organization will have opportunities provided for them that will also be incredible. All right, I'm going to stop there. Brendan, we are probably at time, or maybe have a minute or two. Any kind of last question that you think I should?
Yeah, I think just one question as we wrap the session here, and David touched on this earlier in the presentation, but I wanted to give you a chance to address it too. How is a focus on diversity not in itself a bias? The question from one of the attendees came up. The question always comes up in the organization is how diversity doesn't turn into a quoted biased system. How would you answer that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna. It's a really good question. I'm gonna say two things, and we'll try to keep it brief. Number one, there is research out there that says diversity isn't good, and I've read it, right? And the most salient piece of that research that is actually credible is that when you create a diverse organization, decision-making takes longer. In short, you have many more perspectives. It makes it longer and harder to make decisions. The question is, do you have a better decision? And does that outweigh the length of time that diversity takes, right? And again, there's data on how long and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't really matter, right? And there's also the pushback on that is, yeah, well, you make quicker decisions, but they're not the right decision. Then you have to make another decision. You end up spending the same amount of time as if you would have had a more diverse group to make a much stronger decision on the front end. We can't act as though that the conversation about diversity is just like diversity is great and we can't discuss it. So you do have to have a conversation about the values of diversity, what the potential downsides are. The key thing there is your organization has to make a choice about, do you value diversity? And it is a bias. It is a bias. Here's the thing that when I do these conversations, a bias by itself is not negative. There are good biases to have. Every single thing you have in your job description is a bias towards something. We are all biased towards some things. The decision you have to make are the things that you are biased towards going to help your organization, right? So the question that he asked, is diversity in itself a bias? My answer is yes, it is a bias. And as an organization, you have to decide that this is a relevant and important bias that helps us find great people. So the word bias is so coded now that as soon as you say bias, you think it's bad, right? But if I say I am looking for people with technological skills, that is a bias.
Right.
And by the way, that's a good bias, because I run a software organization and I'm hiring engineers. So you got to be really technologically savvy, right? That is a bias, and it's a good bias. So that was a longer answer than I meant, but it's a great question. You got to reframe how you think about it.
Thank you, Chaka. I mean, great presentation. Obviously, we only have an hour today, but you covered a lot. I encourage everybody on the screen, you see both of the books that I'd encourage you to check out. Also, you can follow Chaka on LinkedIn, and his email here is listed as well. After the presentation here, everybody will get the opportunity, if they want, to download today's presentation. So that'll be sent out to folks as well. And I want to thank you. I mean, this topic is so important. I know, for our organization and the Carlson School as well, we all feel like not only is this important for our workplaces, but our world right now. And so really appreciate the time and the content today, Chaka, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and absolutely, anyone connect with me on LinkedIn, shoot me an email. The context piece is so important, and the kind of question that you all have that are contextual, I am more than happy to talk about it. That's not a plug for consulting. This is not what I do. I just like talking to people and helping them understand what they do. So definitely feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or email me. Always happy to talk.
That's great. Well, with that, thank you for attending today's Way We Work program. Look for future programming at waywework.com, and we will see you in 2021. Thanks, everyone.